So welcome everybody. This is Vishal Sachdev here. I'm a faculty at the University of Illinois and also the director of the Illinois Maker Lab, which is the world's first 3D printing lab in a college of business. And this webinar is being conducted placed inside our 3D printing course on Coursera, which you can look up, 3D printing profs on, Twitter, Facebook, and also just 3dprintingprofs.com, which is, so we are doing this with two faculty here, Eric Reinfish and me, and this course is brought essentially to the world in partnership with Autodesk and Ultimaker. So it's a series of 5 courses. We call it a specialization. And I expect most of you who are viewing would probably be already enrolled in the course. If not, you can look up on 3dprintingprofs.com. So today we are fortunate to have Bob and Tom, and I'll briefly share their LinkedIn profiles on the screen as well. So those of you who are already in the course would have seen me discuss the report that Bob and Tom worked on from PwC about how 3D printing is coming of age. So we want to discuss that and a little bit get some more context around the research that went into producing this report, and get the benefit of Bob and Tom's expertise, and perhaps have some Q&A with the viewers after that. So Bob and Tom, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Bob, I'll start with you. Could you give us a brief overview of your background and tell us how you landed up, researching this space?
Sure. Thanks, Vishal. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody. The genesis of the report was actually out of some curiosity we had with respect to the broader issue of disruptive technology in manufacturing. So we started to explore some of the concepts of what technology, a larger ecosystem of various technologies might mean to manufacturing today and into the future. So we started doing the research, trying to understand what our clients are currently experiencing, do some surveys to understand what their current mindset is around the use of that technology, and start to explore sort of the art of the possible. So we go into a lot of this research without, a particular outcome in mind, and try to use sort of a data-driven, orientation around some of the questions that we have. So some of the things that we've been exploring are, obviously 3D printing, advanced robotics, the Internet of Things, sensor technology, artificial intelligence. And sort of the larger ecosystem that we're calling sort of Industry 4.0, which is the next generation of manufacturing, where you put all of these technologies together, and then the combination of the technologies with the data, the analytics, et cetera, we think actually will significantly change the face of manufacturing in the next even 3 to 5 years. So as we started to explore that, we did individual research papers on specific technologies. 3D printing was one that I was particularly curious about, and one of the early papers that we did. And actually the paper that we released in April was an update. As you may have seen, we were actually doing some comparisons of where we are now in 2016 to where we were the first time that we had done the report a few years ago. So it's interesting now to not only do the research, to ask the questions, to get a sense of what our clients are thinking, but to actually be able to do some comparisons and see the evolution of that thinking as well.
Nice. Okay. Tom, could you introduce yourself, your background, and sort of your approach to this area of additive or digital manufacturing in general?
My name's Tom Waller. I'm a director here at PwC. I work with Bob quite a bit on disruptive technology, specifically in the 3D printing area here. We've written a couple of papers and a couple of blogs. I've done the research on that and helped write those particular papers. So Bob and I spend a lot of time looking at the 3D printing area and seeing where it might head in the future for the manufacturing companies in the US and globally as well too.
So let's start first with perhaps a summary of the major findings of the survey itself.
Sure. So, I think as we started to ask the questions, I think one of the first sort of blanket questions that we were looking for is what's the level of adoption or the mindset around the adoption of 3D printing in the manufacturing environment. And then as we started to dive a little deeper, we want to understand the types of applications that may be used. If they are not yet adopting, what some of the barriers might be to that adoption. And I think thematically, I think it's been interesting to see that we were a little surprised in the first survey how quickly additive manufacturing was already being adopted in some way by companies. I did not expect the level of interest to be as great as it was even in the early stages. I expected just at the beginning, which in some ways it is. But I think in the early stage, it's been very oriented towards research and development, experimentation, maybe moving into prototyping. The first survey was probably further away from sort of mainstream production. And one of the learnings that we had from the update is you can see that evolution. We're moving more into mainstream production. Confidence in the technology is growing. And there are some other interesting learnings in terms of concerns around maybe the talent and the expertise and the training and the things that you need to go to sort of full-scale production with the technology, knowing that you need completely different skill sets to work in this environment. So I think that the main learning was that 3D printing is clearly on the rise. It will have a significant impact on manufacturing, and we're already seeing that evolution in just a few short years.
Any thoughts on the changes? I know we'll delve deeper into some of the other findings, but so PwC did this survey 2 years back as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what changed during that time?
Yeah, I think that the largest change that we saw was probably one of the greatest concerns or barriers to the adoption of the technology in the first survey was around quality. Probably the two biggest concerns were the quality and concerns around intellectual capital, right, and protecting intellectual capital. So I think in the 2 years that has gone since the last survey, those two factors alone have come down considerably. They're still probably top of mind relative to some of the barriers, but it's very clear that the concerns around quality has come down considerably. And that's good, because I think in order to have a mainstream adoption, you've got to have confidence in the output of the technology, and that comes with time, that comes with ongoing use and experimentation. So I thought that was a good trend to see in a short period of time.
Nice. Okay. Good. Yeah, I think particularly on IP, we had a discussion with John Hornick, who's with Finnegan law firm in DC, and they have a practice around 3D printing. So he had an interesting viewpoint that we might get concerned about IP, but quite frankly, a lot of this, he uses the term called a lot of this innovation, or if you want to call it IP violation, is happening outside of control. Away from control. So there's really not much you can do about it. Perhaps mirroring what happened with, the attempts to use DRM in music, and then finally the industry gave up. That is just not possible to enforce those. So, he sort of said that, the first question that comes up is how do you protect IP? But he says in many cases that just doesn't matter, because there's a lot of it is happening away from control. Of course, we've heard of several examples of trying to control or monitor the use of designs, or streaming those designs via protected methods or something like that. Tom, perhaps over to you. One of the interesting things that has come about in perhaps not just in the PwC report and others as well is about the significant increase in end-use parts, or sort of using 3D printing or additive for end-use parts. Any sort of highlights about that in the survey?
Well, yeah, I think on the end-use parts and all, what we found in this particular survey is previously, when we did this 2 years ago, there was a lot of thought to use this in prototyping and those type of things, which made sense at that time. The machines were much slower 2 years ago than they are today too. But I think through the experimentation that you're seeing in the marketplace right now, as machines get faster, the quality improves, more inks become available, even metal inks along with the plastic type inks. You will see in the future here that you're going to see some movement to high volume production as well as low volume production aspects of 3D printing. We're probably quite a way still from high volume production. I think you see that in the surveys just because of the fact that the 3D printings relatively right now are slow. But I think you'll see in the future, I think in our survey there, about 32 expect 3D printing to eventually be used in high volume production in the next 3 to 5 years or so. So I think you're going to see that become more of a reality in the future. But the key is that machines have to get faster, and more inks need to become available in that particular aspect too.
Certainly, I think we have. I think so. If we had another discussion in the course with Zach Sheldon, who's at Lux Capital in New York, and they've invested in Shapeways and a couple of other firms in the space. And I think he had put together a case for the developments in hardware, software, and content. So the the digital content. I think there clearly we were seeing that hardware is going along the same price curve as what we saw computing equipment, with Moore's law.
Right.
And software, we partnered with Autodesk, which gives most of its software for free, and now it's all just web-based. You don't even need to do downloads. So I think those two barriers are gone. Now what's left is really the materials. And I think every day we see some innovation happening on the material side. So it looks like, I know there were some concerns, perhaps, what we saw happening last year with, reflected in the stock price of the big three firms. And still, some people are saying that 3D printing is sort of on a decline, so to say. But the fact that the survey shows the end-use parts are becoming so much more of the entire use case for 3D printing suggests that, it's probably on the hype curve. It is coming to a level of maturity. Would, both of you agree or disagree on that?
No, I would agree on that. I think we're still, in my view, in the early stages.
Okay.
I think we're still not even yet to maturity. And the reason I think that is if I look at the use cases and I think about the evolution, immediately companies start to think about this application in products that are designed to specification and looking to unique manufacturing capabilities, unique design capabilities. The innovation that's going to come from the technology is going to take time as you have more and more users of the technology. Not unlike, I see, my own children now want, 3D printers on their desktop at home, right? Well, what does that mean? It's much like, have everybody having a computer in their home, right? The innovation, the comfort with the technology will create more use cases along the way. So I think the innovation that's going to come from this and the possibilities that yet exist in terms of the design capabilities, not creating products that were already manufactured with traditional methods, but creating products that could not have been manufactured with those traditional methods. That's where I think the future is.
Yeah.
And I do think, to Tom's point, that the barriers, not only with the speed and the cost of the technology to do large-scale production runs, we're not quite there, right? So whether it's the speed, the cost, the quality, those things will come along where we'll have, larger full-scale production runs of product. But I really think the innovation side is what's going to be the future for additive manufacturing. It's the things that we can't make today that will be made with this type of technology.
Bob, I think a major manufacturer, one of the very large manufacturers, already this year has committed that one of their parts for airplanes is going to be 100% 3D printing forward from now on. So as those things happen, you'll see more adoption and people looking to see how they can incorporate 3D printing into their own factories.
Yeah, Bob, you brought up an interesting point that when people have access to this technology, and particularly on the desktops, and we in the lab we have 20 desktop printers. The kinds of things that people make is absolutely amazing, and most of it, well, I wouldn't say most of it, beginners and stuff do start off with just printing what's available on Thingiverse and stuff like that. But the variety in the kind of products that get designed, I think somebody, I don't remember who was saying this, that the number of products that are out there in the market today might just be, in terms of variety, I'm not talking about volume, but in terms of variety, might just be 5% of the actual demand that's out there. Because when you have these tools of production democratized, anybody can be a maker. That's the message we are sending out with this course, and that allows for an infinite variety in products that can be designed and produced at maybe just 5 pieces. You don't need a run of 50,000 or 1 million anymore. Mm-hmm. I think that brings out an amazing amount of variety in the products, and I think that might take us one day towards that, the customer, the true market of one, designing products for each person. So that's an inspiring view. Someday we'll reach there.
If we really start to think of the art of the possible with this, right? It's the innovation, it's the creativity, it's the on-demand nature of this. I mean, one of the other findings from the survey is just the supply chain disruption that will be created from the technology, right? Again, so the old way of thinking of, so while I'm sitting here talking about large production runs in the 3D printing world, there's certainly cases that we may never need a large production run again if it's print on demand, right? So there are going to be completely new business models created as a result of the technology and innovative ways of using it. But you're right. I mean, the production of one and the on-demand capability combined with the unique nature or the innovative sort of creative side of the use of the technology will completely change business models.
I know you at PwC you're looking at 3D printing as one digital manufacturing technology. So could you help place this as a piece of the overall puzzle or an ecosystem of technologies?
Sure. Yeah, there's any number of examples, but maybe one that I think would be an interesting case to look at is if I think about, say, field services in the energy sector. Okay? If I wanted to combine a group of technologies, starting with sensor technology and cloud, where I am real-time monitoring the performance of a piece of equipment because of the ability to capture data across a large, not a single piece of equipment, but my entire portfolio of assets, right, in remote locations. Gather the data, analyze the data, have predictive analytics around that data that can start to not only react to when there's a failure on a part, but begin to predict when that part might fail. To send somebody into the field who's maybe not a technical resource, and think about wearable technologies, think about artificial technology or artificial intelligence. And you can put somebody into the field who can maintain that piece of equipment, and if a part fails, you could print a replacement part on demand, right? Even if it's a temporary part that reduces the downtime rather than ordering a part and waiting for it to come. The combination of all of these technologies and the way we would manage assets would be significantly changed. So you'd reduce the downtime, you'd reduce cost. You would also probably centralize some of the technical expertise that you need because of the remote access to that expertise,
Sure.
either artificially or through the wearables. But to me, the 3D printing in that example is the on-demand nature of printing replacement parts to reduce the downtime.
Nice. I think an extreme case of that, we featured that in the course, as well as, of course, what the Made in Space firm has done with NASA, putting a 3D printer in space. And now they are looking at a bigger project of actually creating, or I think they've just, NASA has, or I don't know if it's NASA or DOD, have funded the project to actually figure out how you can create structures with materials that you find in space, on let's say Moon, or if you ever land up on Mars. In fact, just today at the lab, we have a group of kids, 8 to 12 years old, who are working on the design thinking process. And their prompt is that we have a team of people who are settling on Mars. How are you going to solve some of the issues they face about, water, about, the kind of buildings they will need. So they're working on that right now, and I can hear some of them in the background. So I think that's an interesting case study.
Another thing there too is that not only NASA, but the DOD and Navy and Air Force are experimenting with 3D printers on aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
Because if you think about something breaks on an aircraft carrier and they got to fire up an F-16, F-22, or F-35 to bring a part in from the mainland, that costs a lot of money. But if they got a 3D printer sitting there on that aircraft carrier, they just make the part right there and put it into their airplanes, and they're good to go.
The space example, one of the challenges when we started thinking about supply chain disruption and even working capital, right? So what do you do if you have on-demand printing of parts? Okay, so you reduce your inventory of replacement parts. You don't have to carry as much in inventory, but you do have the materials that you need for the 3D printing process. So all you've done is really shifted the type of inventory that you carry.
True.
So I like the space example because now what you're saying is, well, my material may be coming from alternative sources, and you're solving for that problem.
Yeah. I think we've seen some other examples of, using sand in a desert and using a heat source and a reflective heat source, so solar energy, fusing sand together and making glass structures, in a desert. I think that was quite, 2 or 3 years old example. On that, topic itself, perhaps, Tom, in the survey that was done, I think it was about 120 firms or 220 firms?
It was about 125 firms, and we averaged about 119 to 121 responses to each question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And did you have a sense of how these were split along size or number of employees or any of that, just to get a sense of, were these small and medium, or were these all large firms?
It was a combination of all. We had a few firms that were over 40, 50 billion. So that gives you an idea. You can probably narrow down those firms pretty quick that were responding there on those. Okay. And then we had about a third of the firms were probably between about 2 billion to 10 billion in size. Okay. And then the remainder were we didn't go below $250 million. So the remaining firms were 250 million up to 2 billion. So
okay.
Mm-hmm. So it's pretty well a third. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's not surprising that the largest firms in the early days, because of the availability of capital and the appetite for making investments in some of this, were some of the earlier adopters and some of the thought leaders around some of this. I think the survey, to Tom's point, the surprise for me was how far down it went in terms of the adoption, and that even the smaller firms were getting on board, certainly quicker than I expected. I thought the survey would tell us that it was mostly the larger companies that were adopting, and in fact, we're seeing it across the board.
Let's change tracks a bit and see whether, based on the survey or your own experience and research, what are some of the things that are holding back adoption or increased adoption of these technologies, not necessarily just 3D printing or other additive or digital, even CNCs are now available on your desktop, and lasers are at the desktop scale as well. What are things that are holding back firms, or environment, or their own assets?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is if I think about manufacturers in general, right, and the world that I'm sort of managing within the firm is across 8 very diverse subsectors. But if I think about it just broadly across manufacturing, I think the number one barrier is just their own confidence in the technology.
Okay.
Manufacturers generally are a little slower to adoption in a lot of different technology, right? If I think about manufacturing relative to other sectors, they tend to be a bit more conservative and maybe slower to adopt newer technologies. Ironically, some of the most advanced technology you have is in manufacturing, but notwithstanding that, it tends to just come along a little bit slower. So I think there's a cultural aspect to this that, to adopt something so dramatically new, and oh, by the way, a lot of these companies have significant investments in infrastructure and capital in their existing businesses, right? Mm-hmm. If this does become truly disruptive to those businesses, it could also be very disruptive in terms of your balance sheet and the capital that you've already invested and how you redeploy that. So I think it's a bit cautious in terms of how they go about working with the technology, experimenting with it. So I think confidence is probably the biggest barrier, which is why the survey results over the last 2 years and seeing some of those changes was interesting to me, because I think it's changing relatively rapidly. I think there'll be a bit of an exponential sort of curve here as more and more people talk about it, more and more people acknowledge their own confidence and start to announce the use cases and their adoption. I think this is going to ramp up pretty quickly. But it's probably the confidence by itself, along with so when I say confidence, that could be confidence in the quality, confidence in the intellectual property issues, all of that kind of wrapped up into one.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things that we saw in the survey specifically, to add on to what Bob just said, was that I find this interesting, is that the uncertainty in quality, which shows that people are experimenting with it and have been using it over the last 2 years, that was at a 47.2% in the first survey. That dropped to 33.1% in this particular survey right now. And what was very interesting then was that printers are too expensive was only 31.5 in the last survey, but now it's 42%. They think it's too expensive, which also leads me to think that people are going, hey, this might really work, and they're trying to figure out how to make it more cost effective for their companies right now.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I guess that's they're in serious evaluation, and then I guess to get the specs you need, and if you're looking at additive to replace your traditional manufacturing, or at least for some part of the supply chain, you start climbing up the price ladder to get the specs you really need and the reliability. Interestingly, I think I remember, and I forget who I was speaking to at a conference, and anyway, so I think the summary of that discussion, surprisingly, was that additive manufacturing, and this was, I think, the main use case there was metal, and for big firms, it might be an airline who was experimenting, that from one print to the other, they were getting variation in specs. And that was surprising for me, that even we say that 3D printing, you're really not worried about its perfect duplication, but at the structural level, there are still issues to meet specs. So that was an interesting, so as you get more, more into evaluating this technology to replace, and we've done prototyping forever with this. It's been around 30 years. But once we get into end-use parts for critical parts in airplanes or in other critical applications, I think we are coming up against new challenges perhaps at the molecular level as well. So one of the questions that came up inside the course was around IP, and this gentleman, who is actually an undergrad student who's looking to pursue some research on new materials at a university, So his question was that if he was to find a new filament mixture, so a material with a little innovation on that, is that would that qualify for a patent?
Yeah, I'd have to probably leave that question to the attorney. So,
Okay.
but I suspect that if you came up with something that's truly unique and new, that in layman's terms, it sounds like something that would be patentable. But I think that's probably a better question for the attorneys.
Okay, but was there a discussion or questions around IP concerns for manufacturers? What were some findings?
Yeah, I do think that, as we talked, the concerns around protecting that IP were probably the greatest concerns, right? And a lot of that was just, competitive in nature, right? Understanding what it means, and before you jump in with full adoption of the technology, do you understand the risks and the rewards? And so naturally, intellectual property is one of the biggest concerns that was raised early on. But as we said, that's already waning considerably. In some of your earlier comments, I think people, not unlike other industries, other sectors, and other business models, you start to understand it and you adapt to it, or you come to grips with some of the realities as well. And so I think it will probably always be a concern, no different than the music industry today. It's still a concern for the music industry, but we've adapted to it. So I think that will come down over time as well.
Okay. Another question that came up, had some active discussion inside, was we've had these FDM, with essentially printing with plastic on desktop for quite some time. What is the likelihood of metal printing being accessible to individuals and small businesses? Is that something that we can look forward to in a year or two, or is it a longer time frame? Any thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, the analogy that I often use is going back to other forms of technology that we've seen over our lifetime, right? It's kind of going back to the question of, will there be a computer in everybody's home someday? Well, we've got multiples of them, and we've got them in our pockets as well. So if you use that sort of analogy, you have to believe that the natural course of this is more and more of this technology will be available for home and commercial use at any level. And the advancements in that technology will allow different materials to be used as well. So I tend to think of it, down the road. And oh, by the way, that the speed with which that happens tends to be much faster than we anticipate early on. And so technology, any indication, I'd have to believe the same is going to be true here.
Okay. Tom, any thoughts on that?
No, I think I totally agree with Bob. And the part about the speed's always faster is that there are limitations right now, but it always amazes me how fast things turn around. And what our survey essentially shows here is that when we actually put the survey together for a 2-year period, we did not actually expect this to be this far down the road at this particular point. So we're already moving faster than we thought. And I think that there is a tipping point that's going to happen here where it's all going to fall into place quickly, quality will be there, and then people will be in a bad rush to get on board.
Okay, yeah. Hopefully the stock prices go back up a bit, because I've invested in some of them and they've been going down all of last year. We need some more hype around 3D printing back again.
Yeah, they might have been hyped a little bit too much, but
I had one thing that I've always, both of you are in the field of answering questions, to firms who need to figure out their strategy in this space. So what would be the top 3 questions that you get asked to help firms on when trying this, this technology or this space?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a lot of work with clients right now from the strategy side, to your point, right? So understanding understanding the potential competitive and disruptive nature of the technology. So it's top level. If I'm an individual company and I'm looking at this technology and I'm thinking about it in terms of my business model and the competitive landscape, trying to understand whether this is a risk for me or an opportunity, probably both, and how do I develop my business and corporate strategy around that. All the way through supply chain implications and understanding how to reconfigure supply chains to adapt to the technology, to even things like the tax implications of shifting your business model, your production facilities, changing territorial schemes. So there's a lot that's going on in terms of the impact it has to the business, both from an operational and from a financial perspective. That's where we're helping a lot of companies just assess the risks and the opportunities.
So he's a student in the course right now, Radek Novotny. His question is, did you analyze answers by the type of manufacturers? So high-tech manufacturing versus manufacturers who are using a lot of labor, or producers differentiated by the kind of materials they work with. You know, is it more metals, more plastic, or perhaps even wood? And finally, the industry type, is it more of them were B2B, or was it more B2C?
On that, it's more B2B. That was
Okay.
one of the prerequisites on that. Also, they are more skewed towards industrial manufacturers or
Okay.
technology companies who are trying to supply services to industrial manufacturers, but the vast majority was industrial manufacturing type companies.
Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think going back to the numbers on revenue numbers that you stated, most of them did seem to have a good enough scale to justify suggesting that they were more mechanized rather than high labor cost as part of their cost structure. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We'll keep the forum open for any other questions. If nothing pops up, I'd like to sort of get some closing thoughts from both Bob and Tom about what's the 5-year future that you see for 3D printing and perhaps the larger ecosystem, as you said, Industry 4.0. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I would say that, similar to the thoughts I shared earlier, I think that the adoption of the technology is going to be probably more rapid than people anticipate.
Okay.
And so I expect dramatic change in the next probably no more than 5 years. 3 to 5, I think, is a good time horizon to see significant disruption and significant change in how products are produced and brought to market. And I think the innovation is going to be exponential. The broader ecosystem, I think we're just at the tipping point right now of completely rethinking manufacturing from a technology perspective. And it's actually going to have pretty dramatic impact on talent and the labor force as well, which we didn't spend a lot of time talking about that. But the skill set issues and the impact on the labor force could be pretty dramatic. And this doesn't mean, if everybody's initial fear is, does this mean it's going to take jobs away? Yeah. My reaction is no. I think it's just simply going to shift the skill sets that are necessary to adapt to that new environment. But I do think that there's going to be a skills gap, and there's going to be a significant need to change and adapt to the type of expertise that you'll need to work in this technology and this environment. But I think the world of manufacturing will be dramatically different in 5 years because of additive manufacturing, but also combined with these other technologies.
Okay. I know, hopefully we're trying to fill that skills gap with this course and perhaps some more advanced courses after that. Tom, your thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with what Bob says there. I think in 5 years we'll definitely be at a different place. I think the key overall thing about the manufacturing, and I would, to your point earlier, you said the ecosystem that we're looking at here, it's going to be a shift, I believe, from hardware, actually making the hard product, to the software that monetizes that product over time, so that you may make a piece of hardware, a product or whatever, and then instead of updating it or replacing it, you will be feeding software into that product that updates and replaces it, services it over time.
Yeah.
And predictive analytics as far as parts wearing out and all become a much more robust area for companies to be making money on. So your whole business models are going to be beginning to change over the next 3 to 5 years, and in 10 years, who knows where we're at regarding that. So.
Yes. I think one of the interesting things that we heard from, Professor Hodgson at Cornell was that, a lot of, or most, if not all of the 3D printing or additive technologies are still analog. So once you get to the ability to, he uses the term voxels, and you get to the ability to reconfigure digital sort of configure products and make them with that a digital equivalent to the current process that you have, and you get to molecular assembly, and where you can perhaps use information to configure particles at a subatomic level or at a molecular level, and then have them form into objects. So that brings a totally new dimension of information richness of products. So it's not, of course, we hear about firms selling you the hardware and then keep updating the functionality with software. I think the next step would be where the material itself can sense and respond to information. So I think that's the next frontier. So maybe we'll have, I think Neil Gershenfield said that, we'll have in 20 years, and I think he said that maybe 10 years back, about, finally being able to get a replicator which could replicate things like we saw in Star Trek.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah. So thank you, both of you, and thank you to the viewers for joining. Right, and we hope to touch base with you perhaps when you put out some other research, and we'd love to share that with our students as well.
Now stay tuned. There's a lot more to come.
That's
Thank
right.
you.